The air in the troop transport's hold was thick with the metallic tang of salt and despair. The year was 1944, and the war, which once seemed an unstoppable tide of German might, had begun its slow, gruesome ebb. Among the unexpected cargo aboard the converted American ship sailing for the East Coast were women, a small, diverse group of captured German auxiliary personnel, clerks, and technicians, deemed too valuable for immediate exchange or too politically inconsequential to justify a separate process. Ilse Ritter, a former 22-year-old signals operator for the Luftwaffe captured in Italy, leaned against a cold bulkhead, her eyes burning with a cynical mix of defiance and exhaustion. "They treat us like we are precious cargo, not prisoners," Ilse muttered in German to Greta Vogel, who huddled beside her. Greta, barely 19 and a former Wehrmacht medical aide, nervously traced the outline of a faded photograph, her parents' small farm in Bavaria. "Be grateful, Ilse," Greta whispered back, her voice barely audible over the ship's engines. "No bombs, no cold, only the promise of American dirt." Ilse scoffed. "American dirt is still the enemy's dirt. And I assure you, they don't coddle us out of kindness. It's propaganda, Greta. They want to prove their superior system. We will be put on display, worked until we drop, and shown all the riches that will soon be wasted on their endless war machine." Their destination was a hastily converted internment facility in the middle of the continental United States, far from any front lines, a place designed to process and utilize captured foreign labor. Their arrival on American soil, however, was not marked by the stark, grim barracks Ilse had mentally prepared for. The journey inland, undertaken in the early spring, revealed a landscape that was shockingly untouched. From Ilse Ritter's private notes, March 14, 1944, "The countryside is a jarring sight. I expected factories and military bases, the endless, stressed landscapes of a nation at war. Instead, the train rolls through impossibly green fields and towns that look normal. There is no evidence of the total war we endure at home. Where are the craters? Where is the constant, nerve-shredding grind of mobilization? I saw children playing in an unfenced yard, chasing a dog. They looked fed, too fed. It is a grotesque contrast to the rationing and fear that grips our families in Berlin. The political climate in the U.S., championed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was focused on a dual front: overwhelming military production abroad and national self-sufficiency at home. The Victory Garden campaign, strongly backed by leaders like Vice President Henry A. Wallace, was in full swing. This initiative urged every citizen to plant vegetables to supplement rations and free up commercial produce and transport for the armed forces. It was an iconic symbol of the American homefront effort. When the group finally arrived at the camp, they were met by Sergeant Elizabeth Beth McKenna, a no-nonsense military policewoman whose sharp gaze seemed to penetrate Ilse's defiant shell. Sergeant McKenna had seen the war's effects up close, having been at Pearl Harbor during the initial shock, an experience that hardened her view on the necessity of this conflict. "Listen up," McKenna barked, her voice flat and authoritative. "You are here under the Geneva Convention. You work, you follow the rules, and you are fed. Your first detail begins tomorrow. You will be assisting local farmers." The word farmer in this context sent a chill of manual labor dread through the German women. But the why of it, the context of the labor in this seemingly abundant land, was the first seed of Ilse's astonishment, an irony that would grow into a profound, unsettling discovery. The morning air was crisp and clean, smelling of damp earth and something unfamiliar to the prisoners: unrationed fuel. The army truck carrying the small labor detachment of German women, Ilse, Greta, and 3 others, rattled down a narrow paved road in the American Midwest. an area seemingly untouched by the logistical strains and relentless bombing campaigns that had devastated European infrastructure. Sergeant McKenna sat in the cabin, her profile stern, while a young private with an anxious face stood guard in the back. Ilsa looked out the canvas-covered rear, her eyes scanning the landscape for the telltale signs of a nation truly fighting for survival. Where were the fields of mandatory grain? The signs of total austerity? She saw a sprawling field of corn stubble, yes, but beyond it, neat, brightly painted houses with large, well-tended yards. "I do not understand, Ilsa," Greta whispered, holding her arms tightly. "Where are the empty shelves? The long queues for potatoes? I read a leaflet that claimed American food was severely rationed, yet—" She trailed off, gesturing vaguely towards a passing scene. A small boy with a gleaming metal bicycle, laughing as he sped past a line of freshly laundered sheets. "It's a lie or a trick," Ilsa stated, her conviction firm. "The entire system is a lie of comfort designed to lull their people and crush our morale. They must hoard everything. They must be desperate." Her skepticism was a necessary shield, a way to protect the deep patriotic belief she still held for the fatherland, a belief that insisted her people's suffering was for a just, albeit difficult, cause. The truck finally pulled up to a modest two-story farmhouse. This was the property of Mrs. Evelyn Stone, whose husband was serving overseas in the Pacific Theater, leaving her and her teenage son to run the small farm while managing her duties as a Red Cross volunteer. Stone met them at the fence, not with suspicion or hostility, but with a weary, pragmatic air. "Welcome," Mrs. Stone said simply, her gaze settling on Sergeant McKenna. "The patch is ready." The patch was not the expected commercial field. It was an astonishingly large garden, a veritable acre, perhaps more, behind the house, meticulously organized into long rows. Tomatoes, corn, beans, squash, and an assortment of greens were already showing signs of vigorous growth. Brightly painted signs, hand-lettered by children, dotted the perimeter. One sign read, "Grow your own, can your own, fight the Axis with a zucchini." It was a victory garden. Ilsa and Greta exchanged a long, wordless look. This was not a small family plot to supplement meager rations. This was an industrious, quasi-industrial effort, yet clearly tended by civilians. Ilsa was familiar with gardens. Her grandmother had kept a small plot in Berlin, but it was to feed one family, and every seed was a miracle of foresight. This American garden was an explosion of planned abundance. "This is our victory garden," Mrs. Stone explained, handing out gardening tools, new, well-maintained tools. "The produce goes to our table, the surplus gets canned for the winter, and any extra is donated to the local community canteen and the war effort. We're expected to produce 40% of our own vegetables to free up farm resources and transportation for the Army." Ilsa, momentarily forgetting the risk, blurted out in heavily accented English, 40%? To free up resources? What resources do you lack? Your streets are clean, your houses are whole." Mrs. Stone paused, leaning on her hoe. She looked at Ilsa, not with anger but with profound pity. "Young woman, we lack the men to harvest our vast farmlands. We lack the ships to transport all the food our allies need. And we lack the time to worry about a few cabbages when boys are dying in Normandy and the Philippines. We grow what we can so the Army can focus on the big picture. It is our patriotic duty, as simple as that." Ilsa felt a strange, cold knot of confusion forming in her stomach. It was an economic and social anomaly she couldn't reconcile with her rigid understanding of a nation at war. The enemy was not starving. The enemy was gardening. The work was physically demanding, but, strangely, not punitive. Their task for the next 2 weeks was weeding, tilling, and planting late-season crops under the unrelenting spring sun. Sergeant McKenna observed, but rarely interfered, maintaining a professional, distant neutrality. She understood the purpose of these details extended beyond the simple act of growing food. It was psychological. Ilse Ritter, however, viewed every new detail as evidence of calculated American deception. The sheer variety of seeds they handled, packet after brightly colored packet of tomatoes, snap peas, and sweet peppers, was an offense to her sense of wartime reality. In Germany, even basic food was strictly controlled by the Reichsnährstand, Reich Food Estate, and the availability of such seeds would be unheard of. "It is a trap," Ilse confided to Greta during a short water break by a shed stocked with gleaming, new canning equipment. "Look at the fat earth. Look at the water they waste. They are showing us their temporary riches before the inevitable counterattack. They want us to send back reports of luxury." Greta, meanwhile, was slowly succumbing to a different kind of shock. She was the farm girl, and the health of the soil and the profusion of growth spoke a language she understood instinctively, a language that transcended the political propaganda of both sides. From Greta Vogel's witness account, filed post-war, "I remember the smell of the soil at Mrs. Stone's. It was the rich, deep smell of health. My father's land was good, but it was worn out from generations of hard use and the demands of the war economy. Here, the earth felt generous. They had so much land, so much water, and they planted so meticulously, not just to survive, but to have a surplus. I was weeding a row of carrots, and Mrs. Stone's boy, Thomas, a skinny, awkward boy of maybe 12, came over. He offered me a raw sugar snap pea from a trellis he was building. He didn't care that I was a German POW. He was proud of his pea. I ate it. It was the sweetest thing I had tasted since the war began. That pea was harder to reconcile than any Allied bombing raid." One afternoon, Mrs. Stone brought out a radio while they worked, tuning in to a report on the U.S. home front. The familiar voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, or perhaps a recording of a recent fireside chat, came through the static. "And while our brave boys fight tyranny and defend the free world overseas, we on the home front must ensure our own resilience. Every row of beans, every jar of preserves, every single victory garden is a blow against the Axis, and a testament to the strength of the American character. We are not just feeding ourselves, we are feeding the hope of the world. Let us continue to plant, to harvest, and to win the peace." Ilse listened, her face tight with skepticism. Feeding the hope of the world. That was the language of the enemy, lofty, self-congratulatory, and designed to mask the brutality of war. Yet, as she looked at the rows of vibrant green, the sheer, undeniable reality of the physical abundance was eroding the foundation of her belief. Her government had told her America was struggling, its resources stretched thin, its people unhappy. But the garden told a different story. She watched Mrs. Stone, her hands calloused and dirt-stained, but her face alight with a quiet sense of purpose as she pointed out the best way to thin the beet seedlings. This wasn't the face of a desperate citizen, it was the face of a proud producer, a co-combatant on the home front. Ilse felt a fissure open in her carefully constructed worldview, a terrible, dizzying realization that perhaps the war her nation fought was not against a collapsing, desperate power, but against a wealthy, organized, and frighteningly well-fed opponent. The greatest piece of American propaganda was not a poster. It was a pea the prisoners were housed in a newly constructed, heavily fenced section of a larger, repurposed Civilian Conservation Corps camp. The facility was clean, if Spartan, and the food, while simple, was plentiful, another contradiction that chafed Ilse's pride. One evening, after returning from a grueling but productive day in Mrs. Stone's garden, Ilse found a discarded leaflet tucked into the binding of an old, worn copy of Moby Dick in the small camp library. It was a 1943 propaganda pamphlet for the Victory Garden campaign, complete with cheerful illustrations and statistics. She translated the figures mentally. 20 million Victory Gardens, producing 40% of the fresh vegetables consumed in the U.S. Ilse sat on her cot, the pamphlet crinkling in her hand. She thought of her mother's small, pathetic window box in Berlin, which produced a few radishes a year, and the official Nazi warnings about hoarders who did not contribute their produce to the state. In Germany, self-sufficiency was a desperate measure born of scarcity and fear of the state. In America, it seemed to be an act of collective empowerment and abundance. "Greta," Ilse called, holding out the pamphlet. "Look at this." They boast about it. They are proud that 40% of their vegetables are grown by amateurs, by women and children, to save transport for the military. In Berlin, that figure would be a state secret, a sign of utter collapse. Greta took the paper, her eyes widening as she examined the drawings of robust, healthy crops. "It is not the fear of starvation that drives them, Ilse. It is the desire for control over their own food and a sense of contribution. Remember what Mrs. Stone said? We grow what we can so the army can focus on the big picture." Ilse leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "But they are not truly sacrificing. We sacrifice. Our cities are rubble. Our men are frozen in the east. Our children are evacuated to the countryside. What is the American sacrifice? Planting a few extra beans." "Their young men are dying, Ilse," Greta countered quietly. "The same as ours. But their homes are still standing. Their factories still run. And their people, even the average family, has the ability to choose to grow a surplus. That is the difference. The ability to choose abundance while fighting a war of necessity." Ilse retrieved the pamphlet. Her jaw set. She felt a dangerous, terrifying realization creeping into her mind. The war she had always believed was a struggle between two systems of equal footing, both fighting a grueling battle of attrition, was perhaps something else entirely. Germany was fighting a war of desperate need. America, it seemed, was fighting a war of immense potential. The Victory Garden was a symbol not of wartime austerity, but of civilian resilience built on staggering national wealth and an untouched infrastructure. That night, Ilse retrieved her small forbidden diary, a book of coded notes and cynical observations she intended to keep for historical posterity. She wrote a short, sharp entry, the pen scratching furiously on the thin paper. April 21st, 1944. Midwest Sector, USA. The lie is not in what they show us, but in what they don't have to hide. They have so much that their home front effort is not about avoiding starvation, but about reallocating their immense surplus. The old women and children are not saving their town from hunger. They are saving the government the cost of a train ticket for a shipment of canned beans. Their sacrifice is voluntary and minimal. Our sacrifice is absolute. If this is the true measure of our enemy's strength, not just their factories, but their soil, their women, their children, then the General Staff has made a terrible miscalculation. I fear that the war we are fighting is not one we can lose, but one we have already lost. This single, terrifying thought, the first crack in her loyalty, marked the beginning of a profound shift in her perspective. The weeks bled into summer. The German women's detail continued rotating through different local farms and community plots, always returning to the central, unsettling theme, the ubiquitous, hyper-productive Victory Garden. They saw the community gardens in the parks, planted by local churches and schools. They saw the tiny, meticulously kept patches on apartment rooftops in a nearby town, tended by people who worked 9 hours a day in the humming war factories. The scale of the organized, peaceful effort was relentless. Ilse and Greta had settled into an unspoken routine with Mrs. Stone. The initial tension had softened into a working relationship built on the shared necessity of the harvest. Mrs. Stone, who occasionally received letters from her husband describing the grinding, hellish conditions on the Pacific Islands, maintained her belief in the necessity of the war, yet her interactions with the German women were devoid of personal malice. One blistering afternoon, they were harvesting a tremendous yield of potatoes. Ilse's hands were sore, her back ached, but she worked with a newfound, almost obsessive intensity. She wanted to understand the source of this power. "Mrs. Stone," Ilse began, wiping sweat from her brow, "the war will end. Soon, I think. Then what happens to all this effort? Will you still plant so much?" Mrs. Stone paused, leaning her shovel against a wooden crate, her eyes looking out over the rows of green. "When my husband comes home, I pray we won't need to save tin or worry about transport for the army. But the garden—" She gestured around the overflowing bounty. "The garden is more than a war effort, Ilse. Vice President Wallace called them a spiritual tonic. It gave us all something to do with our hands, something we could control when the news from the fronts was so terrifying. It taught us we could feed ourselves, that we didn't have to rely entirely on big business or government." She paused, then added gently, "It is a habit of peace, my dear. A very strong one. We will be building the peace with these hands too, planting and raising a new world, just like we planted these rows." Greta, kneeling next to a freshly dug row, reached out and picked up a perfect, round potato. "It is a new way to think," she murmured, turning the potato over and over in her palm. "In Germany, they said the war was to gain us Lebensraum, living space, land to feed us. But you have the space already, and you share it with your community." Ilse watched the exchange, a profound sense of melancholy settling over her. The hard, cynical shell she had built around herself in defense of her nation's cause was finally cracking. She realized the fundamental difference. The American home front was mobilizing a pre-existing abundance, not desperately compensating for a lack. They were fighting a war for an ideal, and their ability to feed themselves so effortlessly while doing it was their silent, most powerful weapon. The war would drag on for another year, demanding a terrible toll. But for Ilse and Greta, the sight of the American Victory Garden, the symbol of an opponent not on the brink of collapse but confident in its grassroots self-sufficiency, had done its silent, subversive work. It had planted the seeds of doubt, a bitter harvest for a dedicated soldier. It would be a long, difficult journey back to a Germany that was not only defeated militarily, but starving. And in the years of rebuilding, Ilse would often recall the sight of Mrs. Stone's overflowing garden, a stark, unforgettable image of what true, peaceful strength looked like. The Victory Gardens, a symbol of America's war effort, ironically became a quiet, personal symbol of peace for two astonished German POWs.